Hello, this is Greg Jones coming to you from Duluth, Minnesota. So, today we are going to start talking a little bit about thesis statements or a thesis. We'll talk a little bit about a way we write a thesis statement versus the way that we see a thesis appear in a professional writer's writing. And there is an intentional distinction in my opening slide between thesis statement and thesis, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a minute. We'll also talk a little bit about identifying an unstated thesis, a thesis that I can't put my finger on. There's not a single sentence within this that has sort of encapsulated the entire direction that this is headed. And so if I can put my finger on it, I might call that a stated thesis, but we're going to talk a little bit about finding an unstated thesis and how a complex thesis may give an indicator of the structure of the overall work. All right, that seems like a lot, but we'll break it down and figure it out. All right, so I'm gonna just throw it out there, and I get a lot of pushback in my classroom about this. They'll read something and they'll be like, Mr. Jones, this does not have a thesis. And they'll feel like because it is a short work of nonfiction or even a narrative, like a little story, it doesn't have a thesis. So I argue with my students that yes, it does have a thesis, and we're gonna figure out what that thesis is together. There are, however, some writings, I'm sure, that don't have a thesis, and those writings are things that are objective or factual observations, maybe like an encyclopedia entry, you know, those books that your grandparents might have on some dusty shelf in their library, if they have a library, or you may have seen them out on the curb because people are tending to get rid of encyclopedias because we've got this whole thing called the internet where we can find this information. But anyway, the author's point of view just needs to be defensible in order for it to be a thesis. If you think about an objective writing, it is just like, I'm going to tell you about this particular plant. This is where it grows, this is how tall it gets, etc. There's really not a defensible argument being made there. That someone can't say on the other side, no, you're wrong. I mean, uh, no, they can't do that. All right, so this is the simplest form of putting together a thesis statement. And this is what I tell my students, and that is, all right, identify for me the sort of large topic that an author is writing about and the slant of that author on that particular topic. We talk about this in terms of theme in a piece of fiction as well. Topic and slant. That's the very simplest way to sort of approach coming up with a thesis for a work. And it's a great first step. And so if you see that something is predominantly about something like you know, cost savings within your school district, and then you find out what the slant is on that, that could be the thesis of whatever piece that you're looking at. Maybe it's a letter to the editor. So what we're going to do over the course of the year is really try to move away from that simple topic and slant sort of thesis and come up with a way to really address something that's more nuanced, something that is that sort of captures the larger features of a piece of writing, and maybe the larger features of the argument that you're going to be building if you're the author of this thesis. So this is traditionally how they're described. You may have seen this in a different video, and that is this idea of an explicit thesis versus an implied thesis. Student writers have oftentimes been coached to come up with an explicit thesis. On the last sentence of my first paragraph, there will be a sentence there that is going to give some guidance to a reader as to where I'm headed, what I'm planning to do in this in the rest of this writing. Professional authors don't typically do that. They typically employ what we call an implied thesis. It's unstated. We would have to string together several sentences in order to come up with what it is this author is going after. It's the writing is particularly clear and understandable. It's just that there's not one single sentence or two single sentences next to each other that I can just put my finger on and say, there it is. That's what encapsulates the entire piece of prose. All right, so I'm sharing with you a thesis statement that I wrote or a thesis that I wrote about a narrative in my classroom. And it just reads, adolescence is filled with ups and downs, perhaps feeling like things are a bit out of control, but growing out of it seems equally challenging. And so it's just this idea, that the point of view of the anecdote, and this is what I took from the entire passage. I looked at the beginning, middle, and end, and this is where that passage takes me. I show this to you because within a thesis, we might get an indication of structure. And so this thesis that I just flashed up on the screen shows the progression through the passage. It follows sort of the plot of the narrative. Sometimes the structure is a narrative plot. Sometimes the structure is something like a problem and solution, or some sort of comparison. And we may get an indication that there is a particular form that a speech or essay is following, and it might find its way into a thesis. So what I want you to take away is that you can oftentimes put into your own words a thesis from a piece of nonfiction, and because it's defensible, there are other points of view on that particular topic, whether it's a letter to the editor or even a narrative. Without oversimplifying the idea, I want you to really try to capture the sort of full understanding of a short piece of writing. That's usually the first step of this. And so in the future, as part of the way that you're annotating things for your classroom, jot down a thesis for the work that you're reading. Then try to argue against it. Has the author done a sufficient job really bolstering their argument and defending the thesis? All right. Thank you for spending some time. Goodbye.